A teenage boy sat frozen in his seat at 35,000 feet when every single crew member aboard the plane suddenly collapsed without warning. The passengers screamed, children cried, and absolute chaos erupted in the cabin as the aircraft continued flying on autopilot with no one at the controls. What happened next would push this ordinary teenager to become an accidental hero and save 214 lives before the fuel ran out. Before we dive in, what time are you listening? Where are you from? Drop a comment below and tell me. And please like and subscribe for more videos like this. Kyle. Morrison was 16 years old when he boarded Flight 227 from Seattle to Denver on a cold Tuesday morning in November. He was traveling alone to visit his grandmother for Thanksgiving break. His parents had put him on the plane with strict instructions to text them the moment he landed. Kyle found his seat in row 12, right over the wing, and settled in with his headphones and a book about aviation that his uncle had given him for his birthday. He had always been fascinated by planes, how they worked, how pilots controlled them. He spent hours reading about flight systems and watching cockpit videos online, but he never imagined that fascination would matter so much. The flight took off smoothly just after 8 in the morning. The sky was clear and blue, and the captain announced they would reach Denver in about 2.5 hours. Kyle looked out the window as Seattle disappeared below the clouds. Everything seemed perfectly normal. The flight attendants began their service, offering drinks and snacks. Passengers settled into their routines, some working on laptops, others sleeping, kids watching movies on tablets. Kyle flipped through his book, occasionally glancing out at the endless white clouds below. About 40 minutes into the flight, Kyle noticed something strange. One of the flight attendants near the front of the plane suddenly grabbed onto a seat. She looked pale, very pale. Then she collapsed into the aisle. Kyle sat up straight, his heart beginning to race. Within seconds, another flight attendant fell. Then another. Passengers near the front started shouting for help. Kyle unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up, trying to see what was happening. People were panicking now, their voices rising in fear. Then the pilot's voice came over the intercom, but it sounded wrong. His words were slurred, barely understandable. He said something about feeling dizzy, about losing consciousness. Then the intercom went silent, completely silent. The plane continued flying straight and level, but Kyle realized with growing horror that something terrible was happening. He pushed past other passengers toward the front of the cabin. 3 flight attendants were unconscious on the floor. A businessman was trying to revive one of them, shaking her shoulders, but she was not responding. Kyle reached the cockpit door. It was locked, of course. He pounded on it, shouting for the pilots. No response. He pounded again, harder this time. Nothing. His mind raced through everything he had read about planes. The door was reinforced, impossible to break through. But the pilots were supposed to respond. They were supposed to open it in an emergency. Unless they could not. Unless they were unconscious too. A woman behind Kyle started screaming that they were all going to die. Children were crying throughout the cabin. People were pulling out their phones, trying to call loved ones, writing final messages. The panic was spreading like wildfire. Kyle forced himself to think clearly. He had read about this, about cockpit door procedures. There was an emergency code, a way for crew members to override the lock if the pilots became incapacitated. But he did not know the code. Only the crew knew it. He ran back to where the flight attendants had fallen. He searched their pockets, looking for anything that might help. One of them had a small card in her uniform pocket. Kyle pulled it out with shaking hands. There were numbers on it, procedures, emergency codes. His eyes scanned frantically until he found it. The override code for the cockpit door. He memorized the numbers and ran back to the front. Kyle entered the code into the keypad beside the cockpit door. For a moment, nothing happened. Then he heard a click. The door unlocked. He pushed it open and stepped into the cockpit. What he saw made his blood run cold. Both pilots were slumped in their seats, unconscious. The captain's head was tilted back, his hands limp at his sides. The co-pilot had fallen forward against his harness. The instrument panel in front of them glowed with dozens of lights and displays. The plane was flying on autopilot, but Kyle knew that would not last forever. Eventually, the fuel would run out, or the flight path would end, and the plane would begin to descend. And if no one was at the controls when that happened, everyone on board would die. Kyle stood there for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds. His hands were shaking, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. He had read about cockpits, studied diagrams, watched videos. But this was real. This was 214 lives depending on what he did next. He thought about his parents, about his grandmother waiting for him in Denver. He thought about all the passengers behind him, the families, the children. He could not let them die. He would not let them die. He stepped forward and carefully moved the co-pilot's unconscious body back in the seat, making sure he was secure. Then Kyle sat down in the left seat, the captain's seat. The controls felt foreign under his hands despite all his reading. The yoke, the throttles, the hundreds of switches and buttons. He took a deep breath and looked at the radio panel. He needed help. He needed to contact someone on the ground who could talk him through this. Kyle picked up the radio handset. His voice shook as he pressed the transmit button. He said that this was Flight 227, that the entire crew was unconscious, that he was a passenger with no flight training. He said they needed help immediately. For a moment, there was only static. Then a voice responded, calm and professional. It was an air traffic controller from Seattle Center. The controller asked Kyle to confirm his situation. Kyle repeated everything, adding that the plane was on autopilot, but he did not know for how long. The controller's voice became more urgent but remained steady. He told Kyle to stay calm, that they were going to help him. He asked Kyle basic questions about what he could see on the instrument panel. Kyle described the altitude indicator showing 35,000 feet, the speed showing around 450 knots, the heading indicator. The controller told him he was doing great, that they were bringing in experienced pilots to talk him through landing the plane. Minutes felt like hours as Kyle sat in that seat. Behind him, passengers had crowded near the cockpit door after realizing what was happening. Some were crying, others praying. A few were shouting suggestions, but Kyle blocked them out. He focused entirely on the voice coming through the radio. A new voice came on, identifying himself as a retired airline captain who was now helping from the ground. His name was Robert Chen, and his voice carried a confidence that made Kyle feel slightly less terrified. Captain Chen asked Kyle detailed questions about the instruments, about what warnings or alerts were showing. Kyle described everything he could see. Chen explained that the pilots had likely been overcome by a sudden decompression event or contaminated air, but the passengers were safe because they were behind a barrier. He said the autopilot was set to fly toward Denver, but they needed to divert to a closer airport. He needed Kyle to start learning the controls, and fast. Over the next hour, Captain Chen walked Kyle through the basics: how to read the altitude indicator, the artificial horizon, the speed gauge, how to use the radio to communicate, how to make small adjustments to the autopilot. Kyle's hands stopped shaking as he focused on each instruction. He repeated everything back to make sure he understood. Captain Chen praised him after each successful step, keeping him confident and focused. But then came the hard part. Captain Chen explained that Kyle would need to land the plane himself. The autopilot could bring them close to the runway, but the final approach and touchdown required manual control. Kyle felt his fear return in full force. He had never flown anything before, not even a small plane. How could he possibly land a commercial jet? Captain Chen seemed to sense his fear. He told Kyle that thousands of pilots had learnt to land, and that he would guide him through every single step. He said Kyle had already proven he could handle this by staying calm and following instructions. He just needed to trust himself and trust the guidance. They diverted to a smaller airport in Montana that had a long runway and less traffic. Emergency crews were already assembling there, fire trucks and ambulances lining the taxiway. Captain Chen explained that Kyle would need to disengage the autopilot at the right moment and take manual control. He would need to reduce the throttle gradually, adjust the flaps, keep the nose steady, and touch down smoothly on the center line of the runway. It sounded impossible. Kyle practiced with the controls while the plane flew toward Montana. He touched the yoke gently, feeling how the plane responded to the slightest input. He practiced moving his feet on the rudder pedals, learning how they controlled the direction on the ground. Captain Chen talked him through every sensation, every sound, every movement. Other pilots and controllers joined the radio channel, all focused on bringing Flight 227 down safely. The airport came into view after what felt like forever. Kyle could see the long strip of concrete below, the flashing lights of emergency vehicles. His hands gripped the yoke tighter. Captain Chen began the landing instructions. Reduce speed to 200 knots. Begin descent. Lower the landing gear. Kyle found the gear lever where Chen described it and pulled it down. He felt a heavy clunk beneath him as the wheels extended. Green lights appeared on the panel. Gear down and locked. Lower the flaps to 15 degrees. Kyle found the flap lever and moved it carefully. The plane's nose dipped slightly. Chen told him to adjust the trim, explained where to find it. Kyle made the adjustment. The plane steadied. They were descending now, dropping through 20,000 feet, then 15,000. The runway grew larger in the windscreen. Kyle's heart hammered against his ribs. Every muscle in his body was tense. 10,000 feet. Captain Chen's voice remained steady, walking Kyle through each step. Reduce speed to 180 knots. Flaps to 30 degrees. The plane slowed, descended steeper. 5,000 feet. Line up with the runway center. Kyle adjusted the yoke left, then right, trying to keep the nose pointed straight at the long strip of concrete. 3,000 feet. Check speed, check altitude, check alignment. Everything Chen said, Kyle did. 2,000 feet. The runway filled the entire windscreen now. Kyle could see every marking, every light. Flaps too full. Reduce throttle more. 1,000 feet. Chen told him to start the flare, to gently pull back on the yoke to raise the nose just before touchdown. 500 feet. The ground rushed up toward them. Kyle pulled back slowly on the yoke. The nose lifted. 200 feet. Hold it steady. 100 feet. The plane crossed the runway threshold. Kyle held his breath. 50 feet. 20 feet. He pulled back a little more. The main wheels touched the concrete with a heavy thump. The plane bounced slightly, then settled. Kyle immediately pulled the throttle all the way back and pushed forward on the yoke to bring the nose wheel down. It touched with another thump. They were on the ground. They were down. Captain Chen's voice erupted in celebration over the radio, telling Kyle to apply the brakes gently. Kyle found the brake pedals and pressed down carefully. The plane began to slow, slower and slower until it rolled to a complete stop in the middle of the runway. Emergency vehicles surrounded them within seconds. Fire trucks, ambulances, police cars. Kyle sat frozen in the captain's seat, unable to believe what had just happened. His hands were still on the controls. He had done it. He had actually done it. Paramedics rushed onto the plane within minutes. They checked on the unconscious crew members, starting immediate treatment for what they suspected was carbon monoxide poisoning from a faulty ventilation system. All 3 flight attendants and both pilots were rushed to the hospital. They would all survive and make full recoveries. The passengers were evacuated down emergency slides, most of them in tears, hugging each other, hugging the emergency responders. Many came to the cockpit to thank Kyle personally, some sobbing, others unable to speak. Kyle stepped off the plane on shaking legs. The reality of what had happened began to sink in. He had saved everyone. 214 people were alive because he had stayed calm and followed instructions. The airport manager wrapped a blanket around his shoulders. News crews were already arriving, their cameras pointed at the plane, at Kyle, at the incredible scene unfolding. The story spread across the world within hours. Kyle Morrison, the 16-year-old boy who landed a plane and saved hundreds of lives. He appeared on every major news network. The airline called him a hero. Captain Chen flew to Montana to meet him in person, embracing him like a son. They stood together at press conferences. Chen explaining how Kyle's calmness and willingness to learn had made the impossible possible. The pilots and flight attendants he saved sent him messages of gratitude, thanking him for giving them their lives back. But Kyle remained humble through it all. In interviews, he said he was just doing what anyone would do in that situation. He said Captain Chen was the real hero for guiding him through it. He said he was thinking about all the people behind him, all the families who deserved to make it home. He said fear had tried to take over, but he chose action instead. The aviation community recognized Kyle with numerous awards and honors. He received his pilot's license on his 17th birthday, fast-tracked through training because of his experience. Several airlines offered him jobs once he finished school. Flight schools wanted him to speak to their students about crisis management and staying calm under pressure. Kyle's story became a case study in aviation safety programs around the world. The faulty ventilation system that caused the poisoning was identified and fixed across the entire fleet of that aircraft model. New protocols were implemented requiring better air monitoring systems and emergency backup procedures. Kyle's actions had not only saved lives that day, but would prevent similar incidents in the future.